I love that line, so I flipped it into a normal spin. Popped it out of that. This guy was basically in the same configuration as you astronaut trainees are going through in your triple axis trainers, only in a jet tumbling out of the sky. You also get the sense, and very accurately, that the rivalry between Crossfield and Yeager never ended, even beyond Crossfield's death. In fact, after this episode aired, I got a phone call from Chuck's wife, and was very enthusiastic. Oh, good, he liked it. He hated it. She explained to me very carefully and very diplomatically, because she liked the show a lot, that basically Yeager was pissed that I had included anything about Crossfield whatsoever. So, oh well. I'm going to show you one more clip about Crossfield, because he's going to come up every so often in this thing. And this one is, the X-15 was introduced right at the tail end of that. The X-15 was a rocket plane that was capable of Mach 7 and altitudes above 250,000 feet. This thing could literally fly into space and then come back and land all under pilot control. It was how America was planning to go into space until Sputnik and the Soviets really put up some challenge, and suddenly the goal became to get somebody up there as fast as possible, and rockets became the way to go. Crossfield was one of the co-designers on the X-15 and its first test pilot. So he was involved in all the early flights on the various engine configurations, etc. And the engine they were waiting for, the million-pound thrust engine, finally came through, so Crossfield was obliged to test this thing in a test stand. It was bolted down, and he was basically in a shirt and tie. And I'm going to show you what happened the day he did that. And we have to do the same deal again, so... okay. We're just going to stack them up there. X-15 static test.
The big engine was finally ready. Capable of burning through a ton of fuel in 11 seconds, the engine was mated to the X-15 and locked into a steel framework for a series of ground test firings.
We'd run an engine as a test engine several times, and things were looking pretty good. A lot of these developments are such, you run into trouble and trouble and trouble, and all of a sudden things begin working. We were on that curve. The last engine run before the first flight with the big engine, I was in the cockpit. This was just a ground run, so I was just in a white shirt and my business suit pants, and sitting in the airplane running the darn thing. Just like being in the sun. Everything around me was orange. I stayed in there because I had a good idea that being in that steel X-15 with all that fire around me was probably I was better off than trying to get out. And here comes an Air Force fuel truck with water coming out of it like Niagara Falls. And in the bottom of that waterfall was a guy named Art Simone, one of our mechanics. I still kind of choke up because he was coming through that fire to look after me, and I was better off than he was by far. I was in this big steel. He came up and got to the airplane. Of course, I couldn't wave him away because all of that bright shining on the windshield, he didn't know whether I was alive or dead. And he would try to open the canopy, and every time he put his hands on the fuselage, he'd jerk them away. I could see his flesh searing. He just didn't have the power against his reflex action to keep his hands on there long enough. I didn't want to crawl across that hot fuselage, and so I just jumped out. And I landed, I didn't wait for anything. As soon as the canopy came open, I jumped out and I landed on him, and we got out of there. And nobody really was injured in that whole thing, fortunately. Him or me, his hands were burned, but not really as bad as I thought. He just didn't have his hands on there long enough to make it very serious. But I went in the office right after that, and before we could even tell the company that a $50 million airplane was spread all over the landscape, the media started calling. They have good pipelines. And I told them, relax. The only casualty was the press of my trousers. The fireman got me all wet when I jumped out of the airplane. And then I winced when I knew what I'd given the bastards, because sure enough, that old story, East Coast newspaper comes out with X-15 blows up pilot wets pants. It gets your attention, I'll tell you that. You're not scared. You're too busy wondering, hey, there's got to be a hole out of this thing. There's got to be a door. That seems to be the nature of people like me. They're always trying to figure out where's my back door. And frankly, after it was all over, it just damn ticked off that you lost a good airplane.
When Scotty died about a year and a half ago, the first thing we did was stuck that clip on YouTube as a sort of tribute. And immediately it started getting all kinds of response. Amidst all of it was a government conspiracy, it didn't really blow up stuff, was one from his son, who didn't know that it happened. Scott never talked about it. Right stuff indeed. Back to where we were. So let's see now. Okay. This is going to just take me back to these guys. Okay, seems to be sort of almost working so far. Now, not that once these guys became astronauts, they weren't still involved in some really heavy-duty, brave stuff. This, for instance, is the Mercury Atlas configuration that astronauts like John Glenn rode to orbit. Glenn was the first to ride the Mercury Atlas. And in fact, 2 of the previous 5 had blown up when he strapped himself on top of that thing. Mercury, as I mentioned, was a means of getting into space as quickly as possible. It was a response to the Soviets, which had launched Sputnik, and were preparing to launch their own astronaut. So the X-15 was sort of out of the picture. What they were going for now was basically a ballistic capsule that would have very, very little astronaut control. He could control the attitude very slightly, but nothing really beyond that. It was a tiny little thing. They used to say about it, you didn't ride it, you wore it. In fact, astronauts were expected to understand that they had actually achieved orbit, or at least 0G, by the washers and other stuff the workmen had left in the capsule, which would float up in front of their faces. That was the only way they knew. That and their straps would float up. They didn't feel a thing. They were just packed in too tightly. Now, one of the keys to this kind of enterprise, any kind of enterprise really, is of course mission redundancy. All of the key parts, the mission critical components, there need to be a couple of in case things break down. The big trick can be figuring out what those specific components are and where you're going to build in your redundancy in very little room. Fate 7, which was the last of the Mercury flights, the last time anyone went into space solo, Gordon Cooper was the astronaut. He flew a 33-hour mission, and during the course of that, everything in the spacecraft broke down. Computers went out, his power supply went out, he lost his attitude control, he was no longer able to line up for re-entry, he had to do it by hand. And no one quite understood why this was happening. It was just one thing after another going. It was like a bad piece of software. When they got back, they discovered the problem had been, sorry if this is slightly indelicate, his urine collector had leaked. And extremely conductive fluid had gotten onto every exposed circuit in the control panel of the vehicle and shorted everything out. There was, of course, no way of doing that during the flight. So they corrected for that thereafter. Of course, that was the easy one. It became a lot more complicated